So sponsoring Adam's talk is Linode. If you haven't used Linode, it's fantastic. Shared SSD VM server infrastructure. It's all SSD, super fast CPUs, great support. I have about 14, 15 servers there. All the servers for the conference are there. So Linode's really fantastic. Just can't recommend them enough, especially with use with Forge, for example. We use it with Forge constantly. Just really great, just fantastic pricing, and definitely highly recommend them. So thanks a lot to Linode for sponsoring the conference. Literally couldn't do it without them. They've been super generous in offering a $20 credit to all the attendees. So if you get a 1 gig server there, that's 4 months of that server for free. So that's really a great way to kick off a project or a new site for yourself or anything like that. Get it rolling for most of a year, a good chunk of the year for free, right with that credit. So definitely check out Linode. Any server stuff you need, highly recommended. I use them myself as well as the whole team here at Userscape uses them. So check it out. Okay, now we're going to grab Adam. Adam, I don't see you in the attendees, Adam. It could be that you just put your name as Adam, but there's 4 of them. A little hiccup here. Let's see, raise your hand if you're the Adam who is supposed to be speaking next. Oh, there he is. We got him. All right. Okay. There he is. All right.
Hello.
Beautiful.
Does it sound like it's using the right audio gear?
Oh, you sound a little low.
Low?
A little low to me.
Increasing the volume a little bit. Is that a little bit better?
A little bit better.
If I go any higher, it's going to clip.
Feedback from the crew.
Hello, 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 hello. Hello?
I mean, I can hear you. It doesn't sound like you're talking into that mic in front of you. I guess you are. Okay. We'll run with it. I can definitely hear you.
Okay.
Just a little.
Yeah, all right.
All right. Let me go ahead and you can share your screen.
Let's see what we can do here. How's that look?
Good.
All right.
All right, you're set.
Ready to go?
Yep.
Ready to go. Hey everybody, welcome to Laracon Online 2018. I'm Adam Wathan, and today I'm going to be talking about advanced Vue.js component design, which is really the same thing as, oh my god, scoped slots can do that? So let's dive into a little bit of demo code and demo app to sort of set the stage here so we kind of know what we're looking at. So I have this little demo component that I cooked up here. It's a new thread form for creating a discussion on a forum. And none of this stuff is really interesting except this tags section down here. So you can see in the Vue DevTools, this is like a subcomponent, right? And it looks like just a regular input, but if we play with it a little bit, you can see that it's actually like a nice little tag component where we can press enter to add a new tag. We can go through each one of these and click like the X to delete them. If you try and hit enter when there's no tag typed, it won't add an empty one. It won't let you type duplicate tags or anything. If you hit backspace when it's empty, it'll delete the previous tag. So there's some interesting behavior and stuff here that I want to dive into a little bit on the code side too. So let's take a look here at the actual, this is not the right, I guess this is right. Is there any way for me to like get rid of this stuff so I don't have to see it on my screen? Is it showing up for you or no?
It doesn't show up for us, no. You should be able to move it off to the side.
That's just, yeah, okay.
Or hide it, I believe.
Hide video panel?
Could be.
Something like that. This will have to do. Okay. So here's the code for that component. So it's pretty simple. We got kind of like a wrapper div here. We got some classes on some things. We loop over whatever the tags are that are in the component. We just render them out, and then there's a button to delete each tag that just calls this remove tag method. And then after that, we have the input field where you can actually type the new tags. So there's a couple different event handlers here. So we're listening for the backspace key. And when we listen for the backspace key, we check, well, if there's no tag currently typed, well, then we want to remove the last tag in the list. So that's what we're doing here. We're also listening for the enter key. So whenever someone presses enter, we check to see, well, if they've actually typed a tag, so it's not just an empty string, and the tags list doesn't already include that tag, then we want to go ahead and add that tag to the end of the list, and then clear out whatever the user had typed so they have sort of a fresh input field. And then aside from that, we just got like a simple V model thing going on so that the input is bound to this new tag state here so that we can reference that when we're going to add the new tag. So it's a simple little component, but it is interesting in some ways, and it does have some sort of interesting behavior baked into it. So the way that we've kind of built this out right now is already designed in a way that makes it pretty easy to reuse throughout our application, right? So you can see in the parent component here, all we have to do is sort of drop in a tags input, pass in the tags that we're binding to it, and then we're good to go. But maybe you're building a component like this, and you've done a little bit of work to implement some of this sort of interesting behavior or kind of tricky problems that you had to solve. And you think to yourself, you know what, it would be kind of cool if I could turn this into like a library that other people could use, something I could publish on NPM and people could pull into their projects as well. There's a couple of considerations that you sort of have to think about when you're trying to publish something as like a third-party library that people are going to use in different applications. So if you look at our component here right now, it's pretty opinionated in terms of like styling, right? We have these blue tags with like a dark blue X and like a darker blue text with no border. We've got some specific sort of margin in between each one. We've got this input field here, which has like no border of its own. It's got like a specific placeholder. You know, there's just all sorts of like pre-baked in sort of UI decisions. And if you're trying to turn this into something that people can use on a variety of different projects, then you're going to want to try and make it more flexible and more customizable so that when someone pulls it into their project, they can sort of make it look and feel like it fits in with the rest of their UI, right? So when it comes to this sort of UI visual customization stuff, you have a few different options for how you tackle it generally. The first option is to provide style props in your component, right? So say we have this like tags input here, which this is just how you would type it to use it in another component. If we wanted to customize, say, like the background color of each tag, well, maybe there's a prop for specifying that, and it can take like a hex code or HSL or whatever you want. But there's all sorts of other things you need to worry about here too, right? Like maybe the text color of the tag or the border width if you want to add a border, or the border color of each tag, or the font weight for the tags, or the icon color, or the spacing between each tag. It just can kind of really explode into tons and tons and tons of different customization options. And you can see this in real libraries in the real world, like Stripe Elements, for example, which is like a React library under the hood, but is rendered in an iframe. They give you all sorts of different options that you have to pass in if you want to try and style it to look like it fits in with your application. So this is not like a terrible, terrible way to go, but it is like a lot of customization that you have to think about, and it can be sort of a pain for someone to actually work with because they have to kind of like pass in these explicit values in their JavaScript. They can't rely on their existing CSS and stuff like that. So it can be kind of a pain. So what are some other ways that we could sort of handle customizing the look and feel of sort of a component like this? Another way is to use CSS hooks, right? So this is kind of the most traditional approach that I've seen, and you'll definitely be familiar with it if you've ever pulled in a third-party JavaScript UI library like Select2 or anything like that. The way it generally works is here's our component. We expose a bunch of classes like tags input tag, tags input text, tags input remove, and you just sort of document those in your README or whatever, and you tell people, hey, if you want to customize how it looks, here's kind of the classes, here's the elements that they're attached to, you provide whatever styling you want. And at the end of the day, that looks like something like this. Here's like a less theme file for select eyes, for example. So you end up writing like a bunch of CSS here to kind of style that component. And this can generally work, but there's a few issues with it. The first one that comes to mind is that you're sort of forcing people to write CSS that kind of adopts your own sort of naming convention. Maybe this doesn't bother everyone, but it sort of bothers me when I've made some really conscious decisions about the naming conventions and organization that I want to apply to my own CSS. And now to style some third-party library, I have to try and name things their way, and things don't really match up. Like maybe I'm using like a BEM convention and they're using something else. It just makes things feel a little bit messy. On top of that, you can also run into naming conflicts. So in this case, there's like a form control class in select eyes. Well, that's like a really generic common name, right? I might already have a form control in my application, and now I have to worry about trying to override the styles for my own class when I'm trying to style yours with all these nested, highly specific selectors and stuff. I'm not going to get into it much deeper, but I think most of us can kind of agree that if you've ever tried to style a third-party UI component by writing your own CSS for it or trying to theme it, it's definitely not the funnest experience. But needless to say, it is one way to do it. And if you want to avoid things like class name conflicts and stuff like that, there is an approach to tackling that, and that is using class overrides, right? So using that same Stripe elements library, you can see that they provide options to configure the names of the classes that are applied to different pieces of the component. So we could do something like that too. We could say that the wrapper class is whatever you want, and we can use our own naming convention here, this sort of like Pascal case, double underscore, weird thing. So that's totally like an approach that we could take. And now we get to at least use classes that look like our own classes. We can avoid weird naming conflict stuff, and it solves some of those problems. But the reality is CSS is not usually enough to do all the customization that someone else might want to do. There's always more customization, and it's very, very hard to anticipate every single type of change someone might want to make. For example, maybe they want to put the icon to delete a tag on the left instead of the right. Well, you could try and do that with CSS, but it's really awkward trying to change like the order of elements in the DOM and stuff with CSS. It can get really messy. So it'd be nice if we just provided an option like icon placement, put it on the left instead of the right. Or what if someone wanted to provide their own icon because they already have a closed icon in their application and they want this to be consistent? So maybe we have to provide like a path to that someone can use. Or maybe something as simple as just changing the placeholder of the input. There's all sorts of things that people could want to change. The reality is that trying to customize a component like this, it's like a bottomless pit of different options that someone might need. And again, it's just super, super, super hard to anticipate what those could be. I think probably a lot of us have had this experience of pulling in a JavaScript library, thinking that it's going to be perfect for our use case, and then finding just like one tiny little deal breaker where it's like, if only I could just customize this one thing that the creator of the library didn't think about, then this would be perfect. But because I can't do that, I can't make it look like it fits in my app, and now I have to write the whole thing from scratch myself, and that kind of sucks, right? So what else can we do? Is there any other options for kind of controlling how this stuff looks? So I want to present to you option 3, which is to give up. And I'm serious about this. Give up. Don't try to provide every possible customization option that you could think of to allow the user to sort of style your library or style the pieces of it. Instead, there's a better way to give the user control over how something looks without having to anticipate all their needs with configuration options. And the way that we do that is using a sort of unsung hero feature of Vue that a lot of people I don't think are super familiar with, or at least don't know the full power of, and that is scoped slots. So before we get into scoped slots, let's talk a little bit about boring regular slots. If you've used Vue to any extent, you might have run into this feature. Say we have a card component, and this is just using like standard Bootstrap classes. You have like a card wrapper here. It's got like a header, a body, and a footer. And we have these 3 slots for the content in each one of those sections. And by creating these little slot tags, we're giving like the end user the opportunity to provide their own template, their own HTML that we can drop in here. So we don't have to provide all sorts of configuration or customization options telling them like how to style the card header or how to choose which tag goes in it or anything like that. We just literally tell the end user, hey, you know what? I'm not even going to try to give you the customization options that I would have to support your use case. Why don't you just build up whatever HTML you want? You just send it to me and I'll just plop it in. You know, you handle it. I don't want anything to do with it. And this is what that looks like from the consumer's side. You could just instantiate or just drop in a new card element like this. And here we have like an H1 that we're saying this should go in the header section, okay? Here's a div that should go in the body section with a little subtitle, a description, and like a call to action button. And here's some content that should go in the footer. So you can imagine trying to like support this level of customization with just configuration props would be a nightmare. Would you have like a prop for call to action URL, call to action class, even like call to action tag? What if somebody wanted to use an H4 instead of an H5? It's just like a nightmare, right? The clear solution here is to offload that responsibility to the consumer and just tell them, give me the HTML, I'll just plop it in, whatever. So I think the interesting thing to understand, though, about slots that can really help build the correct mental model to help you really understand the power of scoped slots is to think about slots as just being regular, boring props on a Vue component. It looks like some kind of special syntax and stuff, right? And it kind of is in terms of how it's implemented. But under the hood, slots are really just normal, boring props. So to kind of demonstrate that, I want to show you sort of a made-up React-ish, JSX-ish looking syntax that we could use to represent this same template. So imagine instead of this, we had something like this. We have a header variable that is just assigned to some HTML, a body variable, a footer variable, and then when we create our card, we just pass in that HTML as props. This is like conceptually 100% identical to what we have here. It's just like not possible because this isn't real code that can run, of course, right? But I think this is the right way to think about this stuff. So why don't we take a look at our tags input component here and think about how we could try and apply what we've learned about slots to give the end user complete control over how the actual tag pieces themselves look, these little blue tags that we showed. So this HTML here, this is the blue tag, okay? If we wanted to give the end user complete control over customizing this and just ask them to give us the HTML for the tag, we might replace that with a slot with the name of tag where we loop over all the tags and just render that slot for each tag. In the consumer, when we use the tags input, we might pass through the actual HTML for each tag now, right? So we have a span, we're assigning it to that tag slot, and this is just all the same markup that we were looking at that was previously in the input component itself. What you'll find, though, is if you actually try to run this code, you get a bunch of errors about things that are undefined, that don't exist in the scope that you're expecting to exist. So to kind of better understand why, I think it's a good idea to look at our sort of made-up syntax from before and kind of translate this. So this here is basically the equivalent of this. We have like a tag template variable. Here's the template for each tag, and then we just pass that into the tag slot. So looking at this, you can sort of understand why like tag wouldn't be defined, for example, because if you look at this as just like some JavaScript, this tag variable doesn't exist in this scope. I don't see it defined anywhere. I don't see how I would get access to this, right? So how can we make it possible for this template to have access to the individual tags that actually live inside of the tags input itself? So the answer is to use a callback instead of just a static template. So if we take this and we wrap this up in a callback where we accept the tag and then return some markup, now it becomes pretty clear that, yeah, okay, we would have access to the tag here now, right? Because of the tag is being passed in. So instead of passing static markup to the slot, we would pass in a callback. The child component would invoke the callback, passing through the tag that we need, and now we have access to it, and things totally work. Again, this is just sort of like totally made up syntax and stuff, right? But it looks a lot like JSX from the React world. And in React, what we're doing here is what's called the render prop pattern. You're passing in a prop, which is a callback telling the child component how to render some piece of something given some context. So the equivalent to a render prop in Vue, since Vue uses its own sort of templating approach, even though it does support JSX, but primarily people are using standard Vue templates. The analogy in Vue here is a scoped slot. So let's take a look at what that really means. So implementing a scoped slot in Vue looks a lot like implementing a regular slot with a couple extra little pieces. So here's the tags input component itself. Here we have our tag slot. If we want to kind of pass data to the slot, all we have to do is add it as a prop. And this is basically like an argument being passed to the callback. So here we're passing in that tag to that callback. Now in the parent component, we need to accept the arguments that the slot is passing to us, right? And we do that by adding this slot scope attribute, which takes one object that represents all of the arguments being passed to us from the child. Now, instead of just referencing tag as its own global thing here, we can get the tag from this current scope by just asking for the tag from the props. So let's break away from the slides for a while and instead take a look at some actual code and try and implement some of these changes and just kind of walk through things a little bit to kind of get a better idea of how it works and play with things a little bit. So if we wanted to try and implement that sort of naive non-scoped slot approach to sort of see what the errors are to better understand it, why don't we try and do that? So here in the actual parent component, I'm going to make a little bit of room here so we can just sort of focus on the thing that we're actually looking at. This tags input, we're going to want to pass through some HTML, right? We want to pass through the markup for each tag so that we have complete control over it. So the way that we do that is basically by just copying the markup from the child, pasting that in here so we have a reference to it. We'll do a little bit of tweaking, but let's just kind of get the basics in place here. And then in the parents, let's just comment this out so we still have it in case we need it. But what we want to do instead now is just expose a slot that the parent can fill. So we're going to give this a name of tag since we might have multiple slots here, so it's kind of nice to use names. And we'll just close that off and think about what we need to do as a next step. So if you remember from the slides, we want to repeat this slot for each tag, right? So we're going to want to loop over the tags. And then in the parent component where we're using it, we can make a couple tweaks here. So we don't actually have to loop over the tags here because we're just passing in the template for an individual tag, but we do have to specify what slot we're trying to fill. So let's just make sure that we got this right. So we got the tag slot here that we're filling, and here's the slot with the name tag, and it's going to be repeated for each tag. So as long as I didn't screw anything up, we should be able to refresh this, and we get an error that tag is undefined, which is what we were expecting, right? Because using that sort of callback analogy, it's clear that tag is not defined in this scope. So to fix that, we have to turn this into a scoped slot. So let's add that tag prop that we're going to pass back to the parent. So here we want to say, whenever we render this slot, make sure that we give this piece of data back to whatever data is coming in to fill this slot so it knows about it. And now here, we can actually accept that data by defining a slot scope attribute, naming the scope that comes in. Vue uses props as the name in the documentation, so I think that's a good one to use here. And then instead of just grabbing the tag on its own, we can grab the tag from the props. So let's go ahead and refresh now. And you'll see that generally, things are back to basically working, which is pretty cool. Now, you might be asking yourself, if you've got a keen eye, how come things are working if this remove tag function isn't defined? We're trying to call remove tag here whenever we try to delete a tag, right? And remove tag does not exist in this parent component. Remove tag only exists in the child component down here. So why is it working? Well, the reality is it's not working. If we go back and hit the X here, you'll see we do get a bunch of console errors. Property remove tag is not defined on the instance. So how can we fix that problem? Before we get into that, I want to talk about another topic in the slides here that's going to lead into this, which is that there are many different sort of categories of props that you can pass to a scoped slot. Now, this isn't like categories in terms of like an actual feature in Vue, but conceptually in sort of building the right mental model, I think it's important to think about each prop that you pass as sort of belonging to a specific category of props. So I'm going to walk through them. There's 4 that I've identified. The first one is state or data. So if we look at our code, the tag that we're passing through up here, this is an example of just state or data that we're passing as a prop, right? It's sort of the simplest case. We pass in this tag, we can render the text from it, we could inspect it, we can remove it, whatever. It's just basic state, just a value, nothing special about it. A more interesting category of prop, though, which is going to help us solve this next problem, is actions. So you can pass state or data up to a slot, but there's nothing stopping you from passing a reference to a method either, something that you want to give access to the parent to be able to invoke. And in this case, remove tag would be like an action prop, right? So why don't we pass remove tag from the child up to the parent so that we have access to it? So here in the tags input, let's create a new prop that we pass up to the parent called remove tag, and we'll just give it a reference to the remove tag method that we have here, okay? So now inside the child, we can access remove tag by getting it from our props. So instead of just calling the global remove tag, we can call props.remove tag, pass in props.tag, and again, if we've done things correctly here, we should be able to add some tags and then go through and remove those tags, and that part is back to working. So that's pretty cool. So those are 2 categories of props that you can pass through, data and actions. Now, a little side note here, something that's interesting to know and can clean up this code a little bit, is that the slot scope attribute in Vue, as long as you're working in sort of like an ES6 compatible environment, which you most likely are if you're using single file Vue components, this actually supports like arguments or object destructuring, which is a feature of modern JavaScript that lets you pick individual pieces off of an object sort of declaratively without having to reach into it to grab it. I'll show you what I mean. So instead of declaring this as props, we could declare it as an object syntax where we just pull off what we want. So we want the tag and we want the remove tag action. And now we can get rid of this props dot prefix on everything. And with any luck, this will still work. And it does. So this is kind of nice, right? Because this starts to feel and look a lot more just like a function signature. These are like the arguments that we're passing from here down to here. There's some nice symmetry here, which is kind of cool. So the cool thing about what we've done here is that we've made it possible to completely customize this tag template however someone wants, right? So right now, by default, it's like blue, and we've kind of already talked about the default styling. Why don't we go ahead and add a couple of default tags here so we can easily see what we're doing. And now if we go up here, if we wanted to make the tag background like purple instead of blue, we could just do like BG purple, add a little Tailwind utility here and refresh that. And now we have purple tags. Obviously it's ugly, but whatever. We can make those like lighter purple, and now they're a little bit better. We could make the button like text purple darker. And now we have like a purple button to match the purple background. And, we could even change the text color of this whole thing to be like text purple darkest. And now we got purple text, purple buttons, whatever. We could even add like a border, make the border purple, and now we've got border tags. That's cool. If we wanted to move the button to be before the text, like move it on the left, that sort of icon placement option that we talked about, we literally just move the button. And now it's in the place that we want it to be in. If you want to use a different icon, instead of using like the X, maybe we want to use like a minus sign, we just change it. We have total control. And the important difference to understand here is that we're not changing this for every single instance of the tags input, right? I could totally duplicate this tags input down here, remove all of our changes in terms of styling, kind of revert back to what we had before, which was like the X, and get rid of this text purple darker stuff. And with any luck, now we have two instances of the same component, but they're styled differently. They have like pretty significant differences in terms of even the layout of the subcomponents. So that's pretty neat, in my opinion. Why don't we try and take this a step further, and instead of applying it just to the tag portion, let's see if we can customize the actual input itself as well. So we're going to take like the same approach. We can get rid of this comment now because we've replaced that hard-coded sort of implementation with a slot. Let's take this input, we'll copy it, we'll paste it up into the parent and treat it as data that we're passing in, like markup that we're passing in. And we'll comment it out here, and instead we'll just add another slot named input. And this will be wherever, and this will be where we render whatever the user is passing in as their input. So let's just try and get this working one piece at a time. So we'll make this the input slot. And let's just go ahead and refresh the browser and see what we get. Okay, so we're getting the same sort of errors we were seeing the first pass around, which is now that new tag is undefined. So that's here, that's the V model here. So, like we talked about, this is state that's being kept track of in the child component. We don't actually have a new tag in the parent component. So if we want to bind to this new tag, well, intuitively, we're going to want to pass that through a slot scope, right? As like an argument to our sort of markup callback here. So why don't we add like a slot scope property here, and we'll just destructure out new tag, and we'll make sure to pass that through from the child as well. So up here, I'm going to add a prop called new tag. We'll pass through the new tag. And let's just go and refresh the browser and see what we got. So I'm going to head over to the Vue DevTools here. Everything is working in terms of the fact that there's no console errors or anything. If we go and change the new tag directly to be like hello world, you'll see, okay, it does update in the parent component. But if I start typing here, you'll notice that it's not updating the actual state in the child component. Kind of mysterious. So the best way to sort of understand why that is happening is to talk a little bit about how vModel actually works under the hood. So you may or may not know this, but vModel in Vue is not anything special or fancy. It's actually just syntactic sugar for an attribute binding and an event listener. And here's what it looks like to implement it by hand instead of using vModel. We can say that we're binding the value of this input to the new tag. And then whenever an input event is fired from the inputs, we want to capture that event and update new tag to match the new value of the input itself. So vModel is literally just this. It just expands to that. That's all it really does. And I can prove that by deleting vModel, and we'll see that as long as we didn't screw this up, that we're going to get the exact same behavior that we had before, which is that if I go here and update this prop, hello world, that works. But if I start typing stuff here, it's not reflected there. But now that this is broken up into two separate pieces, maybe it's a little bit easier to understand why. So new tag is being destructured out of the props, and now we sort of have a reference to it in our own scope, right? The reality is, though, what's happening here when we assign the updated input value to new tag is we're just overriding our local copy of the new tag variable. We're not actually updating the reactive data property in the child component. So we have to figure out a way to solve that problem. Well, one way to solve that problem would be to define this callback in the child instead of in the parent. So that way, when we say new tag equals e.target.value, it's talking about this new tag and not sort of the copied reference that we see here. So we can make that work by adding another action prop, right? So let's add an action prop called onInput, the method that should be called whenever an input event happens. And we'll cut this code, and we'll just replace this with onInput. So whenever an input event is fired, we want to call the onInput action. And now up here in our slot, we want to pass through a callback that's defined here. So now when we say new tag equals this new target value, we're talking about this new tag, not the new tag reference that was passed through the slot. So with any luck, if we didn't screw anything up, we should see an improvement in the behavior. So first, let's update this. Hello world. Okay, that's still working. So when we change the data directly, still reflected in the DOM. But now, if we update the DOM, we'll see that that event is propagating and causing this property to stay in sync. So things are working a lot better now. But of course, things aren't fully working. If I hit enter, we're going to get a console error. There is no add tag method. So if we go ahead and take a look at the code here, you can see that on the enter key, we're trying to call add tag, and add tag is not defined in this parent component. So let's just kind of rush through this a little bit quickly so we can move on. But what we need to do here basically is just add the add tag action and the handle tag backspace action as props, action props that we're passing through so that we have references to them. So let's do that here first. So we'll add a handle tag backspace prop. And that's just going to be a reference to our local copy of handle tag backspace. And then we're also going to pass through add tag, which is just going to be our add tag method. So now that we're passing those through to the child, or sorry, passing them from the child up to the parent, where we're defining the content for the slot, we can destructure those out of the prompts that come in. So handle tag backspace, add tag. Now with any luck, both of those features will be back to working. So I can type hello, world, enter is working, backspace is working, I'm not getting any errors there. So everything is kind of working as expected, which is pretty cool. But if you're looking at this code, you might kind of be thinking to yourself, if you're anything like me anyways, this is kind of gross. It feels like we are forcing the consumer to know quite a bit about sort of the implementation details of how this input works. Not only do I have to know about all three of these actions, I have to know about what specific events to listen for to bind them to. I need to know about specific details like preventing the default behavior when someone presses enter. And I need to know that input should be matched up with on input. It's just like, it's too much for this consumer to have to know about. It kind of puts you off of this pattern in some ways because it feels like, what am I really getting here? It feels like I'm just kind of spreading crap all over the place. But there is a way to handle this better, I think. And to talk about that, we're going to have to talk about a new category of slot props. So category 3 is event handlers, or put more specifically, event handler groups. So here's a little interesting tidbit about Vue that you might not know. So in Vue, you can do something like at input, on input, to listen for the input event and call a certain method. This is just a syntactic sugar for a slightly more expanded version, which is v on input, call on input, right? Well, it turns out that this itself is still sort of like a shortcut for another version of writing the same code, which is v on, and then passing through an object where the input key maps to the on input method. So all three of these do the exact same thing. These two are cool, useful in a lot of cases. This one is subtly more interesting though. The nice thing about this one is that we can define multiple event handlers in here. We can define all of our event handlers in one big object and bind those with v-on. So when I talk about event handlers as a prop category, what I really mean is passing through all of the event handlers needed for a certain element into one sort of mysterious black box, pass them up to the parent, and then the parent just has to say, okay, well, here's the event handlers that I need to put on my input. I'm just going to bind those. I don't really know what they're doing or any of the details, and I don't have to care. I just know that I have to bind them, which I think is reasonable. So let's take a look at like implementing this. I'm going to leave this here for reference for now. But if we head back to the input itself, let's add a new prop, and we'll call it event handlers. And in here, we'll pass through an object that contains all of the event handlers that we're listening for here. So we actually have 3, right? We have 2 key down listeners, and we have an input listener. So let's start with the input listener. So on input, we actually want to call this closure. So let's just stick that in there. Now on key down, there's two things that we need to do, and this can be a little bit tricky. Using this object syntax, you don't have access to these sort of like handy shortcuts where you can say dot backspace or dot enter, dot prevent. You have to do that work a little bit more manually, but it's still not too bad. So on key down, we're going to receive an event, and now inside of here, there's two things we have to do depending on what key it is. So if e.keycode triple equals whatever the one for backspace is, I think it's 8. So if it's the backspace key, then we want to call handle tag backspace, right? This dot handle tag backspace. On the other hand, if it's 13, which is the enter key, then we want to call add tag. So that sort of is how we would expand the dot backspace and dot enter portions to sort of this more verbose style. And then to expand the dot prevent, all we have to do here is add e.prevent default. Okay, so this looks like pretty crazy right now, but we can clean this up a little bit later in the talk, but just kind of bear with me. So now we're passing through all the event handlers in one big object. Let's accept all those event handlers, destructure them into our slot, and now in v-on, we can just say, here's all the event handlers for this component. And if we've done it right, we should be able to delete all 3 of these, head back to our demo, and things still work. So now we've removed the need for this slot to even know about on input, handle backspace, or add tag. And not only do they not have to know about the actions, they don't have to know about what events we're listening to and mapping those actions to. So we've pushed some more of that responsibility back into the child component that the parent component shouldn't really have to know about. So, final category of slot props, bindings, or put maybe more specifically, groups of bindings. So it's not as obvious here, but the problem that we have with event handlers, we have that exact same problem here. We're forcing the parent component to know which attributes should be bound to which pieces of data. And the parent doesn't actually need control of this. This doesn't need to be customized. The parent doesn't actually have to care at all. It would be nice if we could take an approach that was more like this, where we just pass back to the parent, hey, here's all the bindings. Just v-bind all of them at once. Don't worry about the details. And it turns out we can totally do that. Value is just short for v-bind value, right? Which it turns out is just short for v-bind value, object syntax. So we can convert this whole thing to the object syntax, just like we did with event handlers, by just passing the bindings in from the child. So let's add a new property here called bindings. And this will also be an object. And we're just binding value to new tag. And that's kind of it. So let's accept all the bindings. Whoop, if we can spell that right, that would be better. Accept all the bindings up in our slot scope here. And if we've done everything correctly, which I hope we have, things are still working. So now the parent component is sort of oblivious to what the bindings are, what the event handlers are. We can remove this, and now we can even go back to the tags input, and we don't even have to pass through these anymore, right? We're just passing through 2 like grab bags now, all the bindings, all the event handlers. So we can get rid of this stuff. And now we have that same benefit that we had with the tags. We can style this however we want. If we want to change the placeholder to be banana sandwich, we could totally do that. You know, there's the banana sandwich placeholder. And I don't have to pass through some funky prop. I literally just change it right in the markup. If I want to make the background green because I'm trying to make my app as ugly as humanly possible, well, I can totally do that. Okay. So that's pretty cool. We have a lot of power here, and we can customize this stuff, and it's pretty interesting. But there are a couple other customizations that this currently doesn't support. So let's head back to the slides for a sec to take a look at that. So what if we wanted to support alternate layouts? So not only just like styling the individual components differently, but also rearranging the components. For example, here's like a tag component from Shopify's admin, where they have the input at the top and the list of tags at the bottom. If we wanted to support that with our current implementation, we couldn't really do it because we have the slots sort of hard-coded into specific positions. The tags come first, the input comes second. So how could we give the parent component more control over the position of these 2 elements. How could we let the parent put the input before the tags? Well, it's the same approach that we took for letting the parent make all the other customizations. We just have to roll it up one more level of abstraction. Instead of letting the parent component have access to 2 individual slots, why don't we create a single slot and let the end user do whatever they want in that slot in terms of how they structure things? If we're only making a single slot on a component, there's no point in naming it, in my opinion. Just treat it as the default slot in Vue. So it would look something like this. We would just add a new slot here, but we still need to pass through all these sort of scoped slot props that were being passed through to these individual slots. So the way to handle this is to just kind of collapse all these down to be all props on the single slot. So let's just work through adding these one at a time. The first one is the tag prop. So let's just move that up. But it's kind of clear here that this isn't going to really work because we don't actually have an individual tag at this point. If we're trying to roll up a level of abstraction, we can't really handle the looping for the end user anymore. They're going to have to handle it. So instead of passing through one tag, we're going to have to pass through multiple tags, which is no big deal. Okay, remove tag, this action prop. That one can just be passed through exactly as it is. The input bindings, those can be passed through as is, but I would say that since we're using a single slot for everything now, it's better to be specific about what element these bindings are for. So in this case, these are the input bindings, so not just any old bindings. Event handlers is going to be the same sort of situation. So I'm going to rename this as well to be input event handlers, just so it's clear. And now we can get rid of these other 2 slots and just make a few changes in the parent component. So instead of having 2 slots here, we're going to want to have just 1 slot. To keep things simple, let's just make it a div for now. And this is going to have a slot scope where we extract all of the scoped slot props at once. So we're going to get all the tags, the remove tag action, we're going to get the input event handlers, and the input bindings. Let's throw all this templating stuff back up into this single slot. Now, neither of these are slots anymore, so let's delete that. These are just part of a bigger slot now. But now that we don't have access to each individual tag, we only have the whole list of tags, we're going to have to take responsibility for the iteration. And down here, we renamed these to be input event handlers and input bindings. So let's propagate that name change here as well. And now, with any luck, if we haven't screwed things up, which it looks like we're good so far, this is still going to totally work. So we were able to sort of refactor this to be a single scope slot. Now, why don't we try and take this opportunity to implement the Shopify layout? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to duplicate this whole chunk quickly. And let's try and make this look like Shopify's. So now that we have control over where the tags are rendered and where the input is rendered, we can totally just move the input above, right? Let's go and take a look here at what happens. So the input is first now, but it's still side by side. And that's because the input is being rendered as like an inline block element because we sort of have applied some of these like tags, input classes and stuff. It looks like we got a little bit of a rogue text here that's not doing anything. But let's apply some different classes to style this differently. We have a regular text input class for regular text inputs. So let's just use that class here. And if we refresh, we can see, okay, we've got like the regular input there now. One thing that is kind of bugging me though is we got this extra border. And the reason we have that extra border is because the tags input still has this opinion that the wrapper should have this class. So since the Shopify version doesn't really need this, let's remove it from the component that they're both using and just move that up to the individual implementation here. So the inline tags one will use that class, but down here we won't. So let's see what effect that change has. Okay, so now we have like a big long block element input and some tags underneath. So we could totally add like some padding under this. We could create a wrapper element here so that we can wrap all these tags up into one spot. Refresh that. That's looking kind of closer to like the Shopify one. Instead of making these like blue, we could make them like gray, lighter, text, gray, or sorry, that's the wrong place to do that. You know, we could do that up here. BG gray, lighter, text, gray, darkest, whatever. I won't go all the way there, but you can see that we're getting closer to kind of that Shopify look, right? And all we've done is used the same component, but with like two completely different visual layouts, which is kind of neat. Might as well finish this off. We'll do text gray, darkest, text gray, darker for the button here. And now that like looks pretty close to like that Shopify one, right? That's good enough for me. Okay, cool. So we've figured out how to support alternate layouts. But one thing that kind of bugs me about this still is that this tags input, it's no longer really responsible for any templating at all, right? All the templating is up to the parent now, but we still have this rogue div. We still have to define a div here for no reason, even though the actual wrapper div is defined in the parent. Here's like that parent one here. Now, Vue has rules about every component has to have one root node. So we can't really remove this because a slot can technically have multiple elements in it. But we can work around it by writing a render function instead of a template. So if you've ever used React, you know that React uses render functions in JSX, whereas Vue traditionally uses templates. Vue also supports render functions, but you might have it in your head that you should only really be using render functions with Vue if you're also using JSX with Vue, since Vue does support JSX. I used to think that way too until I started playing with these scoped slot components and realized that you can actually do some interesting things with render functions even if you're not using JSX, and getting rid of wrapper divs is one of those things. So let's take a look at what it would look like to replace this template with a render function in this component. So add a render function. And what do we need to do in here? Well, the only thing we really need is this slot, right? So how do we access the slot in JavaScript? Well, with Vue, you can do this.$slots to get all of your regular slots, and this.scoped slots to get your scoped slots. Now, to access a specific scoped slot, you just ask for it by name, so we could ask for the tag or the input. In this case, we're just using the default scoped slot, so we just need to ask for default. Now, how do we pass through like the props and all that stuff to it though? Well, you remember that mental model I tried to get you to build about where scoped slots are like callbacks? Well, in the JavaScript version of Vue templates, scoped slots literally are functions. So we just call the default function, and now we can pass through any of the props. So here we can say tags is this.tags, remove tag is this.remove tag. We can say input event handlers, and then we could just copy that from up here, basically grab this object, paste it in. Need to do a couple tweaks though. We need to make sure that this becomes this.new tag, since we do have to use this explicitly when we're in the JavaScript side of things here. And then we also need to specify the input bindings, right? That's kind of the final piece. I think I'm in the wrong place here. Did I miss a bracket? I think so. We need this here. Okay, so input bindings. And the input bindings is just this object. So let's paste that in, update this to be this.new tag. And hopefully we don't have a weird syntax error that's going to screw this up. But if we did it right, I can delete this template, make sure that we return this from the render function. And if we go ahead and refresh, no errors, thank God. And if we look at the elements here now, you can see that we actually have no wrapper div anymore. The tags input is the top level div. So the cool thing about this is this tags input is completely UI-less at this point. It's purely behavior. All it does is handle a bunch of like the interesting behavior that's related to a tags input, but it defers all UI control to the parent. Now you might be looking at this and thinking to yourself, okay, that's kind of cool, but it feels kind of grim compared to the fact that before all I had to do was write tags input vmodel tags input and then be done. Now I have to like re-implement the style every single time. That sucks. And that's like a fair complaint, but there's a way to fix that. And the solution to that is to create wrapper components. So I'll show you how to create a wrapper component quickly here. We're running a little bit low on time, but I think we can power through. So let's create a new file here. We have two types of tag inputs, right? We got an inline tag input and we got a stacked tag input. So let's name them appropriately. So I'll have inline tags input.view, scaffold that out quickly here. And then let's just copy kind of the implementation of that and paste that into the template. Okay, so this isn't going to work totally perfectly out of the box. We're going to need to accept the tags and pass those into this tags input and then propagate the events back up. But that's just sort of like some little wishy-washy details about making vModel work. So I won't get into it too deeply, but you can kind of watch me walk through it here. So we need to accept a value prop, and then we can't use vModel here directly. Instead, we have to be able to propagate this event. So we're going to want to bind the tags for the tag input to our value and listen for an update event. And when that update event is fired, we're going to get new tags, and we're going to need to take those new tags and emit an input event with those new tags. I wish I could talk about this in more detail, but the way that vModel works in implementing custom vModel components is covered really well in the Vue documentation, so check that out if this is new to you. But now in our app.js, we can pull in the inline tags input component, which is sort of like a pre-configured version of the tags input. And now, if we reference that tag here, we should see two copies of the same thing on top of each other, if we've done everything right. And we do, right? So there's two copies of that tags input. So now we can totally delete this one that contains all that implementation detail. And anytime we want to use that style of tags input, we can go back to that same simple syntax we had before, where we're just dropping in like a pre-configured inline tags input. We can do the same thing with a stacked one, right? So we can say stacked tags input. We could go ahead and copy sort of the contents here. We'll keep the wrapper because it's going to be the same in each one. And if we go down and make sure we import that component too, then hopefully I can go back to the parent here, and we can just make a copy. We can say stacked tags input, get rid of the one with all the implementation detail, and crossing our fingers, still working. So now we've got two little wrapper components that are super easy and portable to use, and we have two different styles of this tag thing. The nice thing about this is this component has no UI at all. All it does is handle behavior. Anyone can customize this to their heart's content. There's literally no customizations that are not possible now, which is really cool. So this would be like the perfect way to build a library like this and put it on NPM, where now anyone can customize it however they want. There's no way that this won't be suitable for their application in terms of UI at least. So scope slots are a really interesting and powerful feature of Vue that I don't think get enough attention. And when combined with render functions, you can create these really interesting UI-less, purely behavioral components that are a really, really fantastic way to create sort of portable UI components that can be used by anyone in all sorts of different projects. So definitely check it out, play with that. Thanks very much for checking out my talk. We barely made it on time here. It's almost 11, but that's cool. Again, thanks so much for checking it out. I hope you learned something cool about this stuff. I tweet about interesting tips and stuff related to Vue component design and stuff on my Twitter, which is just @AdamWathan if you don't already follow me. I blog about stuff like this, as well as object-oriented design and TDD and stuff on my website, which is just adamwathan.me. Be sure to ask any questions that you have in the discourse forum that we have, and I'll do my best to get to them. I'm also going to make this repository public. I'll break it down into different commits so you can see all the different steps that we took and see all the different steps of the refactoring. So I'll try and get that done today and post that out. I'll probably announce it on Twitter, so you can go and check that out if you're interested in seeing more details. Thanks, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
All right, that was awesome. So one quick question for you, Adam. There's a lot of questions in there, most of which I think are probably too complicated for us to go into right here. But there was one, we have a minute, that I thought would be something you might be able to take on live here. It's a very basic question, but I've hit this myself, and I'm curious how you organize a large number of components. Like, what's your strategy when you have 30, 50 components, something like that? You just have the one folder and a million components in it, or subfolders, or maybe you could just talk quickly.
Yeah. Honestly, I am kind of a slob in that sense. I know a lot of people are really particular about trying to keep their folders organized and stuff. But for me, I'm happy to throw everything directly into one components folder because I'm never really using the sidebar to access things. So I don't really care.
Mhm.
I'm just using, like your little quick get to whatever new thread form and Sublime or whatever you're using.
Right.
So it's not really until you run into a situation where you have two components that have the same name for whatever reason that it ends up being a problem. But I've literally never run into a situation where I've had two components with the same name. So it's just never been a problem for me. I do the same thing with like my PHP stuff too. This app obviously has nothing in it, but normally my app folder is just loaded with classes. I don't care. Like, so until there's a naming conflict, man, it doesn't matter.
Not very Otwellian. I don't know. Oh, that's funny. Now we learned something interesting here. Like now I'm intrigued. Now I want a whole talk about your disorganization organization. That's next. I love it. All right, man. Well, thanks a lot. Great talk.
Thanks for having me.